mean, Heraclitus' ethics basically ties in with his other views on the nature of reality. And again, it's not something that, but it also ties in with later views the Greeks accepted. They like to speak, especially Aristotle, of the golden mean, the midway point between extremes. But you find, even though that view appears in later Greek philosophy, you find the roots of it here, even in Heraclitus' ethics. We saw that the Logos was his idea of an underlying unity, that underlies the constant change and opposition to reality. And basically, his idea seemed to have been, if we give in to our temptations and desires, then rather than sort of fight them and try to live a life of moderation, where you're not going overboard one way or another, then essentially we're erasing the tension that he thinks should be there. Remember, he even thinks Achilles is wrong in wanting for all strife and tension to cease, because in doing so he didn't realize that he was wishing for the end of all things, because reality for him needs this tension. So the idea is, if we're resisting our immoderate desires, then the tension's still there. But if we just give in to them, then that erases the tension that he thinks is necessary. So, moderate behavior then opposes an unbridled fulfillment of our desires, and he thinks that's where we ought to go. In other words, if we just indulge to the nth degree any kind of habit, something that might be good in moderation, like having a dessert, can, be bad if you give in to it, make you ill or overweight or worse. So moderate behavior entails that we oppose overindulgence, but also on the other side, and we find this in Plato. Plato thinks that we ought to fight against the desires of our lower nature that would have us overindulge in food and drink and things like that. But he also thinks it would be wrong to go the other way and be an ascetic and deny the needs of the body. In other words, you can go to extremes in both directions. And so you see kind of, even way back here in Heraclitus ethics, this view that the best life to live is a moderate life. And Aristotle will later argue that it's also the happiest life for a human being. And you may agree or disagree, but think about the people who seem to have it all together. I mean, do they, live a life of total overindulgence and something, or do they tend to live a balanced, moderate life? Well, okay. Like I say, I probably will not ask you a question on Heraclitus' ethics, but I thought it was worth bringing in. Well, with Heraclitus and Parmenides, we get a phenomenon that occurs a number of other times throughout the history of philosophy, where you find philosophers basically taking absolutely opposite positions on something. And so here you have Heraclitus saying fire or constantly moving waters are a sort of metaphor for reality. Reality is in constant change. And so we find Parmenides, on the other hand, holding the opposite view, that change doesn't really happen. Now, if you were going to go on what your senses tell you, who would you side with? I mean, does this seem to be a world where change happens, or where nothing really changes?
Change happens.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to go with our senses, we're going to go pretty much with Heraclitus. And so you can say, well, how did he maintain, Parmenides, maintain a position that seemed to be so against what our senses obviously tell us, and we would say today against common sense? Well, in other words, how can he hold? Now, he doesn't, I mean, he agrees that we do think that change happens, what our senses tell us. He acknowledges that our senses tell us things are changing, but basically, for him, change is an illusion. Ultimate reality for him is eternal and changing, and reality is ultimately one. There's no many, so this is his answer to the problem of the one and the many. So how does he hold such a view? Well, we're going to get to that in a moment. Little fact that this was in there, and I think your book mentions this. Plato holds that that Parmenides visited Socrates when Socrates was a young man, and Socrates, and we don't know for sure. We don't have any independent way of confirming that Plato was right or not. I mean, Plato also talks about the existence of Atlantis, which is an interesting side topic. But if so, you could date him around 515 to 450. But as I said, most of these dates are approximate, circa there. Socrates, we're going to see, and we saw this in part of the video, even though people like Aristophanes tried to portray Socrates as a nature philosopher who was an atheist and leading his young followers either away from the pantheon that Athens held, the gods that the city revered, or teaching them to follow no gods at all. And you see him trying to get out an explanation in that clip we saw for why it rains that leaves out the gods. And we have him denying the existence of Zeus. Well, Socrates tried to react against this, said he did believe some in the gods, believed that Apollo had given him an insight into how he ought to live his life, and we'll look at that later. But Socrates did try to distance himself from the views of the Pre-Socratics. He was more concerned with philosophy as a branch of learning that investigates issues about how we ought to live. What is a good life for a human being? How do we achieve it? And he kind of distances himself from the nature philosophers because one of the charges against him, Socrates, was that he studies things in the sky and under the earth, which was a charge that was meant to link him up with nature philosophers. And so, but in his early days, he does say that he was schooled in these views as part of his formal training. And we know that even though Socrates was quite poor, he did have a formal education because he probably came from a family with some money. He, in the Peloponnesian War, he was a heavily armored soldier called a hoplite. And the significance of that is, in order to be that kind of a soldier, you had to essentially buy your own, armor, and that took somebody with some means, So at least early on, we think he had some money and probably came from a family with means that did provide a formal education for him. So he was schooled in the views of the Pre-Socratics, and maybe if he was visited by Parmenides as a young man, he might have been enthusiastic about their views, but in later life he sort of distanced himself. Getting out theories of reality was not his primary concern, which raises questions about the theory of forms that we're going to look at. How much of Plato is in that, and how much of Socrates, But we'll talk about that later. Now, he does make the claim, Parmenides, that basically his philosophy was revealed to him by a goddess. Now, today, this type of claim to authority is kind of anti-philosophical. In other words, he doesn't seem to provide arguments for this claim. But so, people think he tried to establish some credibility for his views, get people to read his books by claiming that some of his views were revealed to him. But he does ask people to judge his writings by reasoning. And that is very philosophical. In other words, okay, here's what I believe, and Socrates does the same thing, and look at my reasoning and see if you agree or disagree with it. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing throughout the course, looking not only at the views that philosophers held, but the reasons they gave as to why we ought to agree with them, So this idea of judging something by evaluating the reasoning or the arguments that support it is very philosophical. Well, Parmenides' argument begins with the assumption that we cannot even think of what does not exist. That thought and being or existence are the same. And this was a problem that even persisted in philosophy even into the early 19th century. Into the early 20th century, where Bertrand Russell tried to solve that problem in a very logical, technical way. But in other words, how do we deny existence to something? If I say unicorns don't exist, there are no unicorns, doesn't it seem like I'm saying, well, there is something, namely a unicorn, that isn't? In other words, how can we talk about something intelligibly without in some way assuming that it's around to be talked about. Well, this may seem like no problem at all, but it has been something that philosophers struggle with through the ages, you know. And Bertrand Russell's, just without going into any of the technicalities of it, Bertrand Russell's answer in what he called his theory of descriptions was what really exists is a description in words of a unicorn that we relate to, and that allows us to talk about unicorns, but the unicorn itself doesn't exist. And all we need in order to intelligibly talk about unicorns is a description of them. And so his Russell said all we need to really assume exists then is a description in words or you know, a painting or whatever of a unicorn, and not a unicorn. You know, now I'm not trying to undermine the worldview of those of you who think that unicorns are still around, but at any rate, this idea of you know, referring to what is not started out with Parmenides. So in order to think of something, it has to exist. I have a summary of his argument here. And what that means is we can't even comprehend, we can't even have a coherent concept of nothing. So thinking of nothing would involve a contradiction, because in order to think of it, in other words, in order for something to be the object of our thought, I'm thinking about X. In order for something to qualify as X, it somehow needs to exist for us to think about it, to talk about it, you know. Now, change would somehow involve coming into existence or passing out of existence. And here's the way, I don't know if I should post a thing. I used to summarize the argument in a kind of technical way, but here's roughly what I take them to mean. And I'm sorry, I know not everyone can see this blackboard, but you know, nothing can, or no, come, or maybe the better way to say it is things can't come into existence. The state of being that which is not is for him impossible and inconceivable. In other words, we can't even think of what is not. Now, a professor I had has the best article on nothing I've ever, you know. Now, Seinfeld may have the best TV show about nothing, but he has the best article, technical article by a philosopher on nothing. And if you're ever in a library and you're bored, get the Edwards Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look up nothing, because he does the whole thing tongue-in-cheek, and it's actually humorous. But he refers to the fact that Parmenides makes this claim and then basically breaks his own claim. But supposedly, we can't even think of that which is not. So for something to come into existence, so this would be basically an impossible nothing, that which is not, would be an impossible state, to that which, I'm oversimplifying things, but this is the basic gist of what I think his argument is. So nothing can come into existence because it would have to go from this impossible state of being that which does not exist, or coming from nothing, and be that which does exist. And things can't go out of existence. Because in order to do so, the reverse would have to happen. They would have to go from, that which exists or is into the impossible state of that which is not, again, which is supposed to be impossible and even inconceivable. We can't think of that state, much less, it would be like trying to think of a square circle, it's not just that they don't exist, but the concept is inconceivable. And basically, his other part of his argument is if we define change, if change is coming into or going out of existence, then there is no change. Because we basically have just shown that nothing can come into or go out of existence. And so what we think we perceive by our senses as change is just an illusion. And now, this argument, I think I have it in the slides. Okay, so here's basically where I summarize this. Claiming that something comes into being involves implying that it formerly was not, right? It would need to pass from a state of not being into state of being. But again, the state of not being or non-existence is supposed to be impossible and even inconceivable, can't even be thought of. In other words, we can't think of what is not. So things can't pass from not being into being. That's the first half of this argument. And going out of existence, again, would involve passing from a state of being into a state of not being. And here again, this latter state is supposedly impossible and inconceivable. So, there is no realm of non-existence, so things can't pass from existence to non-existence. And so basically, if change is coming into or going out of existence, and you can't have either, then you can't have change. Now you're saying, this is really messing with my head here. And now, what observations does this argument depend on? I mean, what sensory observations? Morawski, that's a trick question, isn't it? Because isn't the answer that it depends on yes, it depends on. So again, here's the conclusion. If there can be no change, since that would involve either coming into being or passing out of being, either would entail moving from or to a state which is impossible, not being. So Heraclitus and our senses are wrong, and change is an illusion. And the argument does not follow from anything we see. The argument is an argument from pure reason, from just concepts. But note, it leads to conclusions that seem to contradict what our senses and common sense tell us is obviously the case, right? We want to agree with Heraclitus that the river is in constant motion and the flames of the fireplace are constantly moving. Now, there's a word that we use, I believe it's Latin, I don't think it's Greek. Arguments based on reason alone, apart from sense experience, we call them a priori arguments. And he may have been the first to use this type of an argument, but we do find them used throughout the history of philosophy. In other words, arguments from reason alone that may have a conclusion that really messes with what our senses seem to tell us. So what he's saying is, never mind what your senses seem to tell you, I've got an argument based on reason that trumps your senses, and there is no change, even though your senses seem to tell you there is. It's things like this that remind me of Steve Martin, the comedian, you know, the old arrow through the head, wears a white suit. He's kind of old now, you don't see him much anymore. He was a philosophy major, as was Woody Allen. Woody Allen wrote a book on philosophy called Without Feathers, which harkens back to Plato's definition of a human being, or a definition that's thrown out by one of Plato's interlocutors. Somebody says, well, a human being is a featherless biped. So somebody brings up a plucked chicken and said, well, here's a featherless biped. Is that a human being? So Woody Allen entitled his book Without Feathers. But Steve Martin said, you know, 5 years after college, you'll forget just about everything you learned in every class. That is, unless you took a philosophy class, in which case you remember just enough to mess you up for life. Well, hopefully that won't be the case, and I wouldn't have, you know, given most of my life to teaching it if I thought that's all philosophy did. But there are some things. The philosopher George Edward Morse said it's not so much that I had a lot of my own views that I wanted to get out there that made me get into philosophy, but it was reacting against the preposterous things that I heard other philosophers saying that kind of spurred me on. So here we have an a priori argument, and so he thinks that ultimate reality is eternal and unchanging. And so everything that exists must exist in an eternal present. So time, and it's also not separable into parts. Now your book doesn't go into this as much, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But if reality has parts, then one part is not the other part. But separating one part from another by what one part is not, again brings in this state of not being. So he says reality is one and not many, and it's just one undifferentiated whole. Now, what I wanted to look at is, well, first of all, I need comment. I mean, you know, here you have a philosopher holding on to a view that seems to directly contradict what our senses tell us, and this phenomenon occurs often in philosophy. Now, what I want to do here, people are not as conscientious about erasing things as they are about writing them on the blackboard, are they, my colleagues? Because you know it's not students doing this. Let me turn this thing off. I don't think. Okay. I don't think I need it anymore. But at any rate, Zeno of Elea was a disciple of Parmenides, and he tried to defend Parmenides' views using some arguments, two of which are discussed in your text. And the way people refer to the first one is as the dichotomy. The dichotomy argument. And it goes with, I mean, what is the characteristic of a point in geometry? How many of them can you fit on the average line? Right, because they theoretically have no width, right? So you can fit a number. And he basically runs with this type of thing. And the way I used to like to portray it is, suppose you're talking about getting from point A to point B, right? And by the way, what does die mean, the preface, die? Two, yeah, two, right. Now, anybody know what the tome part means? We have anatomy, where you cut things. Yeah, well, basically, the word tome in Greek is to cut something, you know. And so, to dichotomize something is to cut it in half, basically. To cut it in two, that's where. But let's assume that this distance represents any distance going from point A to point B. Well, Zeno points out that in order to traverse from point A to point B, now I know I'm just going to do this without measuring it, you know, so give me a grain of salt here. But in order to traverse these two distances, at some point you're going to have to come to the halfway point between A and B, and let's call this point C, right? But now, in order to get from A to C, at some point you're going to have to come to the halfway point between A and C and call that D. Well, of course, in order to get from A to D, you're going to have to traverse the halfway point there. But do you see what's going on? The idea is this is like infinitely divisible because there are an infinite number of points along this line. And so you never really get to any of these destinations. And so in principle, you can never get from point A to point B. And so how does it support Parmenides? Well, Parmenides says generally there's no change, and motion or movement from point A to point B is a type of change. So he's trying to, give some support to Parmenides' views by saying, well, there's not really any, motion can't happen between point A and point B. And this actually was some people call these paradoxes. They're not paradoxes in the most strict logical sense of the word, but they're paradoxes in the ordinary common sense, that they seem paradoxical to us, that, and I'm told, and I went just to the edges of calculus, so maybe some of you who took it in high school can weigh in on this, but I'm told that the way modern mathematicians solve this is that with the calculus you can show that you can have an infinite number of points summing to a finite distance. And so you're actually traversing not an infinite distance, which would be non-traversable in principle, but a finite distance. And so you solve the problem and you really can get from point A to point B. But it requires some high-powered mathematics to show where the argument goes wrong. That you can sum an infinite number of points up to a finite distance. But these were discussed through the ages. And so this is one of Zeno's famous paradoxes. And so, again, you can generalize this argument, because if the distance from A to B represents any possible distance, and if you've shown you can't get from point A to point B, you've shown that for any distance. So again, it's solvable, but not easily solvable. And the second one that your book talks about is not one that I talk about very often, but it has to do with the swift runner Achilles trying to chase, is it a rabbit, I think? And the idea is whatever distance Achilles goes, the rabbit is going to go just a little bit farther, and so he never catches up to him. The one that I used to like to spend a little time with is sometimes, and this is not in your book, but just to, is the arrow paradox. Take an arrow, and for some reason, I never saw the Hunger Games, so I don't know what, but they're saying that archery, which normally wouldn't get much of an audience because of the Hunger Games, was getting a real big audience in the Olympics. But you take an arrow, that is in flight, right, toward a target. And by now somebody's realizing that I'm artistically challenged. I have trouble drawing stick figures. I was able to pass art in elementary school because if you look like you were at least trying, the art teacher would give you a good grade, and I at least gave the illusion of trying to do something. But look at this eraser. Okay, it's at rest, right? And it's also true of the eraser that it occupies a space exactly equivalent to its own dimensions or to its own volume. So here's a main assumption of the argument. Any body that occupies a space equivalent to its own dimensions I think I'm spelling that right. Must be or is at rest. Right? In other words, the eraser is at rest here, and it's occupying a space exactly equivalent to its own dimensions. So I say, well, okay, what of it? Well, basically, the way he takes the argument is he says, well, imagine an arrow supposedly in flight. At every point in its supposed path, it is occupying a space exactly equivalent to its own dimensions. Hence, if this is true, at every point in its supposed flight, it's actually at rest. So the arrow is always at rest. Now, it's pretty easy to see what's at fault here, right? I mean, just because a body is occupying a space exactly equivalent to its own dimensions does not mean that it's at rest. And in fact, we know from relativity that really everything's moving. We think we're at rest, but you know, we're on a globe that's turning, that's going around the sun, you know, in a galaxy that has its own movement, all kinds of motion. But the arrow paradox, you could see what it was intended to show. If at every point in this supposed flight of the arrow's occupying a space equivalent to its own dimensions, then at every point the arrow's at rest. And so the arrow isn't moving. You know. So, at any rate, well, Zeno's paradoxes are, again, something that philosophers have discussed through the ages, and that basically have not been entirely solved. Well, that's about as much as we're going to do on the Pre-Socratics. Anyone have any questions or comments? I mean, Zeno's paradoxes are something, if you think about them. Well, what I have next is, this is not really something I do very often, but your book has kind of a whole chapter on Socrates and the Sophists, and so I thought we would look at that. I don't know why I devoted 2 class periods to it. We may not take that much time, and we may, so on September 13th, we may look a little bit at a video on the myths of the cave. So you might want to read a little farther, but we're going to see that the Sophists basically were itinerant teachers, and they focus on the skill of rhetoric. And most of the business in Athens was done in the agora or the marketplace. In other words, an open area where people not only bought and sold things, but where people advanced views, people tried to get political stuff done. I mean, you know, what's going on now with the elections is kind of similar to what was going on there, where, you know, you see some of the candidates out there in the open air having a meeting, trying to argue for their position on both sides. And either the candidates or their surrogates. And so getting ahead in Greek society of the time very often required having a certain capacity for rhetoric. That is basically learning how to defend your own position or your own case in the open marketplace. And the problem is that very often with the sophists and the rhetoricians, what matters was not so much trying to pursue the truth at any cost, but teaching people, and wealthy people would take, usually their sons, yeah, it was a very male-dominated society, to be schooled by one of the sophists, because the way, you know, you became successful was to be skilled at rhetoric, and the sophists were very good at teaching people how to defend themselves in argumentation. But the point there was winning your argument, not so much whether or not you were arguing, or sure you were arguing for something that was necessarily true. And so the sophists have gotten a bad rap through the ages. In fact, one of the terms, the pejorative terms we use to indicate a very bad argument is that it is a sophistical argument. And so, you know, Plato and Socrates tried to react against the sophists, but we have a chapter on the sophists, so you know, since it's there, we'll use it. I doubt if I'm going to spend 2 entire classes on them, and I don't have a PowerPoint on them. I rarely discuss them, and now I'm wondering why I even put the chapter in there. But we'll look at it next time, pages 50 to 60 in your text, and look a little bit at. And the sophists were itinerant, and they would travel not only around Greece, but they traveled a lot and encountered views and beliefs in many different cultures. And so the sophists, many of them tend to be very relativistic in their viewpoints. In other words, rather than holding that there's one truth of the matter in philosophical issues, many of them held that the truth was relative and truth was many, not one, and that truth might be relative to the culture you're in. And And you find in dialogues like the Meno, where they try to discuss moral virtue, the views of the sophists are presented at the beginning of the dialogue, saying, well, you know, virtue and might have as many definitions as there are cultures, or even as there are human beings. There's no looking for just one non-relativistic definition of it, like Socrates and Plato wanted to do. So Socrates and Plato are very much, against some of the views of the sophists. And yet, since we live in a very relativistic age, some of the viewpoints of the sophists might be a little friendlier to the views of many people in our own society than are the very non-relativistic views of Plato and Socrates. So they're worth looking at, and so we'll look at that. I don't have a PowerPoint. Maybe if I get inspired, I'll throw one together. But at any rate, so we'll go there next. Anyone have questions? And so we still have several weeks, and I'm working on something for your talks. I'm going to get a little list of some of the films that students have used or that I know about that have philosophical themes, but my list is only going to be a list of suggestions. It's not meant to straitjacket you, and it's going to be mostly on films. I'm hopelessly out of touch with what's going on in music now. So I'm not even going to try to list songs that might have philosophical relevance. Yeah.
Can you give us an example of some of the questions you might ask on a test? Like, I understand that you put a lot of effort into your slideshows, but
yeah. Lots of okay. You're talking about the objective questions, right? Versus the and I will
saying
give
I'm
you
hearing words come out of your mouth, but holy crap, these concepts and everything else. So what I'm saying is, what would you like me to retain as information
Yeah.
that you would ask on, say, a test? Would you say, this person had this thought process, and then it would be four different choices?
What I tend to do is be more detailed in the actual classroom lectures than I am even on the objective part. And basically, what I'm going to focus on there are, some of the types of questions, and I will give you some sample questions on that. In fact, maybe since you brought it up, I'll post that, because it's there in Blackboard. I just have to make it viewable to you. I'll do that.
I'd really appreciate it.
But some of them are going to be simple questions that have to do with the most basic points of these people's viewpoints. What they thought of as ultimate reality. Some of them may be a little more involved in that they'll talk about reasons that they give supporting a particular position. Maybe you'll have to pick out the main reason somebody used versus other reasons. But let me think. I think it would. I'll tell you what. I'll make it viewable to you. It's either going to be in a subfolder, but it's probably not. It's just going to be entitled "Sample Questions," and rather than, because I'd have to fire this thing up again.
That's fine.
And
Yeah,
all that, you know.
I can take a look at it.
But I'll just go up there and do it.
And if I have questions, I can ask
Since you make it up, you know, and my, you know, some of it is I tend to focus on the most basic points of the views that they actually held and on supporting reasons. I mean, a lot of, and also on objections that might have been brought. You know, I mean, there might be a question on why Anaximander didn't think that one of the four elements was a legitimate choice. Why did he think we needed to go deeper into the Epeiron? You know, you know, and you
so
know,
are your
one of the options
choice
might
or
be
short?
that some of these were. Yeah, these would be multiple choice. Usually just, they're not multiple choice. They're all going to have one answer. Some of them might have an all of the above or none of the above answer. A few of them might be A, B, neither A nor B, both A and B. But most of them are just going to be A, B, C, and D. I remember on there is a GRE, specific GRE in philosophy, graduate record exam. And I remember the last two choices on every multiple choice question were all the above and none of the above. That is after they presented four options, you know. But it's not going to be like a Microsoft exam where it might be A, B, and D, you know, something like that.
Yeah,
but I'll make that
if you could,
viewable. I'll go upstairs and log on and do that, or do it from here.
Yeah, I just need a little.
There's no reason not to. And then yeah, if you have some more questions, because I know even though the first test is a few weeks away, if you want.
Yeah, a little bit more
look
focus,
at that,
a little bit
you
more
know,
able to
even now, it might give you an idea of what to focus on. You know. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Well, look at this on 50 to 60. Again, this is not an area that I mean, rarely do I discuss these philosophers, but since your book devotes 10 pages to it, we'll at least look at it. But I don't know if we're going to do 2 classes. We may, you know, I'd rather spend a little more time on the myth of the cave. What I want to do on the myth of the cave is show you this 25-minute video that starts out with the myth of the cave, but also tries to do some to answer the question, what is philosophy? And it does so in a number of ways, which kind of leads into Socrates. And they interview some of who was then people who were then the top people in the field, you know, and they weigh in on it. Because as I said, there's no one definition of philosophy that all philosophers would agree on. You know, so okay, I don't want to make you late for your next class. A word slip, a word slip. So I'll let you go a little more. I have had so many 50-minute classes that I got to pace myself for an hour and 20 minutes.
For my presentation, I was thinking about
I'm sorry, part of all.
patent. Remember?
Yeah.
There and the speed.
Yeah.
It's not dying for the country. It's making the elder bastard die for his and stuff like that. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, there are several things. In fact, that there are times when I've shown. Maybe I shouldn't tell you what parts I've shown, but sometimes we've discussed, you know, Socrates and Plato believed in reincarnation. So did Pat.
That's a
There's a scene, you know, actually more than one scene.
Yeah, where he's standing there in the Greek.
You know,
actually.
but right, a lot of other things come out in the film too.
Okay.
You
So
know.
you think that would be good?
Well, yeah. It's a great movie, and several things are raised there. You know, you want to focus on one thing and get a 5-minute clip. You know, but yeah. If you didn't get one of those,
just real quick.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was
Thanks.
late, but
Oh,
yeah, I want to make sure that I was.
Oh, okay.
just so you look.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, I was only about like a couple minutes late. So.
Yeah, well, let me make sure that I got you down.
Chris Mullen should be on the side.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Got you down there. Yeah, take care.
Have a good day.
Okay. Yeah, good to see you back.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
I just had to take care of it, and that was the only time she
Mhm.
told me to come in, so.
Yeah. Well, that happens
But
sometimes.
normally I don't.
You know. So that's fine. I think
Alright.
you'll be all right.
Have,
Okay.
success.
Take care.